Hey guys, I have kind of a big announcement for the podcast going forward, as there are a few things that are changing. In the coming months, I have quite a lot of things to do in my own personal life, and that would mean that in normal circumstances, I'd probably have to slow down the podcast or just not do it at all. But I do realize that we're approaching episode 100, and I really don't want to slow it down completely, and that also means that I still have to focus on those things. So what I'm going to do is, rather than make regular episodes, what I'm going to do is, for a few weeks, I'm going to be making minisodes. So these mini episodes are going to be going through some of my personal favorite animators or directors and why I really enjoy their work. That's going to continue weekly. I don't know how I'm going to get that up on YouTube. I might bundle them into multiple ones and then put up some of my older episodes on YouTube, or I'll figure something else out. But for now, what's going to happen is we'll have a few more weeks of regular podcasts, and then when I am going to go into sort of mini-sode mode, I will inform you guys on that. So thank you for understanding. We will get to episode 100 eventually, but for now I kind of have to slow down on that in order to get these other things done. And now on to this week's podcast. Previously on Get In The Mecha. There are still many problems that are deeply ingrained within us that we need to solve and come to terms with. But Evo also manages to prove, thank you Shinji, that we don't necessarily like to solve these problems, and these problems are very deeply rooted ones. We're kind of bound to repeat ourselves, and we're bound in this weird state of repetition and nothingness, potentially. I'm Jamal, and you're listening to Get In The Mecha, your weekly anime and manga analysis podcast. From inspiring arcs to game-changing cinematography, I'm on a journey to try and make sense of it all, episode by episode. Enjoy the show. Welcome back to Get In The Mecha, and in today's episode we are looking at Evangelion once again. In today's episode I want to cover Evangelion Death and Rebirth, also known as Death True Squared. I don't know why they came up with the Death True Squared name, but this week I want to talk about why this is important for Evangelion and how we understand it, why organizing and reorganizing information can do wonders for how we understand a series, and so much more. As always, if you do enjoy this podcast, it would be appreciated if you left it a review on Apple Podcasts, as well as subscribed on YouTube as well. But without further ado, let's get into the episode for this week. That is episode 88 of the podcast, a look into Neon Genesis Evangelion Death and Rebirth. Before we dive into all this awesome content to get stuck into, I should alert you that there will be spoilers in this episode for Neon Genesis Evangelion. By that I mean the main series. What I will be covering of Death and Rebirth, because there are a few things which I'll get into which technically doesn't make it completely Death and Rebirth, but that means I'm going to be covering just the main series. There won't be any reference to End of Evangelion, nor will there be any reference to the Rebuild films. I know, in case you are scared about 3.0 plus 1.0 spoilers, you won't find any here. There won't be any Rebuild talk because these are completely unrelated. So just to say that again, that is spoilers for the 1995 series Neon Genesis Evangelion. Recaps are something that I personally wouldn't really consider. I don't watch too many of them. I watch a few, but I don't watch too many of them because I've probably already seen the series which it derives from, and it's pretty fresh in my head. And I don't really need a recap to, of course, recap myself through it. However, because this is Evangelion, and I love this anime so much, it's my favorite anime, I thought it would be worth covering. And I'm actually glad that I took the chance to watch it because it ended up being a really good recap, and one which I didn't really know, or I didn't really know that this type of recap was possible. I thought that recaps were often quite mundane and there for the purpose of simply giving us and redistributing information right back to us. And this really took a different turn, and that's why I want to cover it, because it does some very special things which I didn't really know recaps were capable of. So Eva Death and Rebirth also goes by the name Evangelion Death True Squared. I don't understand the meaning behind it, but it is what it is. What I've read though is that you're supposed to watch this after watching the main series and having an understanding of it. And I was skeptical at first when I read this. I thought, why would you, if you've watched the series, what's the point of watching Death and Rebirth? And I think that argument still holds up, but I would also say that Death and Rebirth adds some extra value to how it's organized and crafted together. And that is where I do agree with this point. I've dodged watching this for years, and weirdly enough, it does justify its existence, and I was only made aware of this not very long ago. I think the term recap in itself is a bit misleading, as it pretty much is a retelling of the series, if you want to stretch it a bit, really because it reorganizes how we view the events, and it organizes it very differently, and that's what we're going to try and get into today. And the final bit of more confusing context is that I also read that there were some complications when it came to Death and Rebirth, and what this really was. I read that it was supposed to include part of the end of Evangelion, and there were a few production complications when it came to the director's cuts and their roles in this, but that didn't really end up going ahead as planned, and so we ended up with Death True Squared, and weirdly enough, it ended up being pretty good, regardless of all the things that might have happened on the back end. I do recommend reading that into that a bit more, because I don't know all the facts, and it is a bit confusing as to what actually happened and the product we ended up receiving. But at least if you do want to watch this, it is available on Netflix, and that's basically what I'm going to be referring to throughout this episode. Death True Squared as it is on Netflix. I'm glad I didn't pass too much judgment on Death and Rebirth. Sometimes you do hear this discourse that all recaps are cash grabs and an attempt to just get a bit more money, and I'm sure there's an economic incentive there too. But I'm glad I didn't pass such judgment on it, because I think that we have to acknowledge that there is an art in summarizing things, not just in terms of in anime, but in film and within books and within the media. That's how we get a lot of information, because it's very packaged neatly. And I think that recaps have to subscribe to the very same thing if they want to be successful. And I think that this one in particular, is considering how dense Evangelion is, it's a very dense anime to get through, and one that's very hard to digest. It's able to get a lot of this information, but still extract the key parts out of it. I didn't feel like there were major things that were lacking, considering that you're supposed to watch this after you've watched the main series. I still got the main grasp of what this entire series has been. So how exactly is it successful? To me, it adds a lot of value to the footage that has already been in the series in ways which I didn't really think that could be done. I'm a very big fan. I don't call myself an Evangelion purist, but I like to think that the footage in Evangelion is damn good, and it doesn't really need much changing or altering. I would leave all these choices the way they were, and Death and Rebirth doesn't really set to change that, but it tries to add more, and the more it adds is actually very good. There are some amazing cuts, particularly near the beginning, where we end up cutting to words as opposed to cutting to the next shot, and these words were never there. It's stuff like destruction when we're fighting what I believe is the first angel, and Shinji the Eva enters Rageman for the first time. We're offered this message of destruction, and it's not as if we don't know that that was already a thing, but it rubs in the message and it further emphasizes it. I think as a recap movie, which its goal is to rein in those big themes, destruction is a massive theme of Evangelion, and how we're able to tolerate destruction It seems kind of weird that the logical way to do this is to literally tell us destruction is happening right now, but I kind of like that. The first thing that came to my head when I thought of this was the Monogatari series, and I know that kind of sounds like when people listen to jazz music and say, oh, it's giving me Persona 5 vibes, and yeah, it might sound a bit like that, but it's just that's the only series I know that does it to that level. Not to say that they aren't really very related stylistically, but this is something that I think that this series is very good at doing, but Evangelion adopted this much earlier in time. If we are to really take something from this rather silly Monogatari series comparison though, it's that Death and Rebirth, similarly to the Monogatari series, which did this much later, is able to break cinematic norms, or it either kind of already breaks a lot of norms, to be honest, in terms of narrative and stuff, but it goes even further to do this. To prove a point, it has to break certain conventions in filmmaking, and it does exactly that in Death and Rebirth. I like to think that Death and Rebirth is an opportunity to do this more, as I would assume we're less under the pressures of TV anime and such, but also since there's content to work with and it's not going to change either, as is how we understand either isn't going to be altered now since we've already consumed it, but we can almost adjust it and we can play with it a lot more, and that's why I like Death and Rebirth. It takes the opportunity to alter its content rather than use it as an insert for telling the story once again. A lot of the recaps which I have seen, which to be honest mostly come from anime today or contemporary anime, I don't think that they really seize an opportunity, and I'm sure that there are other reasons for this, involving a lot of things behind the scenes which I don't understand. But I think that the recap as a concept is an opportunity to not only recap but to retell, and to take a bold and unique take, bring a unique take to the story which you've already told, which is unfortunate, but I'm happy that there is something out there, in this case Death and Rebirth, that is able to do so. Getting into another aspect of the movie, what I also think is really cool is how it has managed to make me think more about editing rather than animation. Let me explain this a bit. So, because I've already seen Neon Genesis Evangelion, and I'm sure if you are listening to this, you probably have too, that means that the footage you're seeing isn't... I loved watching it, don't get me wrong. I can watch Evangelion so many times, even though I've only rewatched it once, besides obviously my main watch. But as a result, I'm not so focused on what is going to happen because I already know what's going to happen in a way, even though how it's constructed is different, but I understand what the implications of certain things are and why said things are happening. And so I ended up focusing a lot more on how it was cut together and why certain things were next to each other as opposed to how they usually were in the original show. In short, it's just very nice to be able to appreciate how the footage has been reboarded and rewired, as opposed to just watching it for what it is, or at least the meat of the narrative or the animation and animators, which is also something I'm usually watching for as well. When I'm trying to look for, okay, is this animator coming onto the series here? What are their cuts like? How long are they going for? Trying to guess all these things. It's nice to just take a step back and think about editing for once and how it's been kind of reboarded and rewired here and there. The contents of the scenes for me become less important, and it became much more about where they were placed and why they were placed there. For example, where we end on Death True Squared or Death and Rebirth is Shinji crushing Kaoru once again, even though we go to that scene almost at the beginning of this recap. It reinforces the notion that death is the quote-unquote ultimate freedom, and who is able to evade destruction from the future and the things on instrumentality and stuff. It cycles back to it very nicely. But by repeating footage, which is something which we can do in the main TV series, but it's done to a very different level, I think something like Shinji crushing Kaoru being repeated kind of loses its impact. It's a very long shot. if I remember correctly, it goes on for about 30 seconds, and it's done to music, but it's almost still for a lot of the time being, and then the music drowns out, and then he eventually does it, and then it cuts to black, and then in the original series, though, we cut to Misato and Shinji having a conversation, but in Death and Rebirth, it kind of ends there, and we're met with what looks like Pool of LCL, even though it's water in the sunset, kind of. I don't know which one it is, but the point is that we're able to recalibrate this series to give it new effects in ways that I just didn't think that we could, or Arno, or whoever was boarding these, could really do. You could say, and I'm a bit skeptical about this, but you could say that it is attempting to, this is self-explanatory, I've said this throughout the whole thing, that it's trying to rein in the main ideas, but maybe it's trying to draw us into what we really should be caring about when it comes to Evangelion. I like to think that because of how absurd his philosophy works and the whole meaninglessness of life, I like to think that Evangelion doesn't have a specific meaning, and it's for us to try and interpret, and that's how a lot of the imagery ends up being interpreted anyway, as Arno said in his interviews and all these things. But I think that Death and Rebirth maybe goes a bit against that, because it tries to organize the footage in a very specific way and to reinforce very specific messages. I think this is more so telling us, it isn't explicit, no media will really, or very few media in terms of anime, will tell you how to think about a show or to think about it. But with the recap, which kind of goes outside of the main show which exists, I think it kind of does lean towards telling us how, or at least what to think about much more. That being said, it is still very subtle, but that's just something also to think about. That's just food for thought, because I never really thought about it that way, that it's putting these ideas in a very certain way and packaging them in a certain way to tell a certain message. That's what the EVA does, that's what the main series, that's what anime does generally. But by adding all these extra things, I think it is trying to bring us to focus on more specific things and potentially what is intended to be taken from the series. To build on this a bit more, when we think of Kaoru and Shinji at the beginning, and how Shinji is forced to basically crush Kaoru for the purpose of, defeating the angels and stuff like that, it already gives us a lens to look at the series through. Looking at liberation and the death drive and these things, we're given a starting point for analyzing the rest of the footage going forwards, whether we like it or not. I'm not going to go on for too long on that bit, because that is just something to think about. I will end up getting lost in this topic, and maybe we can pick up on it another time, but I just thought that was pretty interesting. Just to round up this topic on editing, and it also bleeds into our next topic, which is chronology and continuity. My favorite, this is kind of a joke, but my favorite edit within Death and Rebirth is when Shinji is slapped by Rei, and then it goes to the hospital. I don't think that was this intentional meme or something, but it felt like that for sure, because Rei slaps Shinji kind of in so hard that he's in hospital. Not exactly, but I really like that edit because it uses the sound of the slap, but then he ends up being in the hospital bed with her telling him what's going to proceed because of, Angel and Eva stuff. And that's just a reminder of what these can do, and I am a big fan of how it's taken these things. The thing about this, let me just get to the point, is that it's still fun to watch even if you've watched the original series, because it just uses the footage so differently. I thought that this would be a pretty mundane watch because, okay, I've watched Neon Genesis Evangelion, what else can you show me? But when you completely rearrange the footage, it just has a different effect, and as a sucker for Evangelion, I end up watching it because it's just that fun. What is great in terms of what makes Death and Rebirth great is that it shows how it interrelates ideas, or how it connects ideas together, and it doesn't connect ideas completely based on chronology. It does in part, but not exactly. It bases them more, or connects them together more based on ideas and what is most relevant for this character or theme we're exploring, and it will connect those two things together eventually, rather than this is the continuity of Neon Genesis Evangelion and it goes like this in this way and we must follow this route. No, it goes from exploring certain characters to exploring certain themes, and then eventually returns back to Kaoru and Shinji and that main fundamental problem. If we dive more into this point on chronology, Death and Rebirth is probably the best thing about it. The highest praise I can give it is that, or the thing that I love about it the most, is that it is directed by, or its direction is steered by, not just the events and the order which they take place in, but they're directed by the characters and actions and actual dialogue of the series. There are some times in some recaps which isn't bad, but I can get a bit tired of it personally. It's driven by either a narrator or a character narrator that is external to the events. So one example would be the Assassination Classroom recap, which I watched a few years ago, and it isn't bad. I love the series, but what it does is that it takes these two characters, I believe, and they talk about what happened, and it fits the theme of school reminiscing, I get it, but I think it can get a bit cumbersome because they're talking about what happened like it passed, and then they end up going into an event of what actually happened, and it replays a scene, and then they return, and it's just very back and forth thing. But Death and Rebirth kind of just flows. It just glides through for the entirety of the hour and a bit which it runs for. The dialogue is mostly grouped by themes and ideas, which either has always been, when we discuss either, we're usually talking about, certain philosophies or certain characters. And I think it definitely helps that for us who do analysis too. And generally, it just helps us get a better idea of the bigger picture and how these smaller ideas fit into the larger narrative. By reorganizing, we can reshuffle and recompartmentalize, if that's the good term to use. We're able to put these into very specific zones within the runtime. I don't want this podcast to seem like I'm punching down on other recap episodes. There are other good recap episode type things or retellings which are good, and some which I still need to explore, no doubt. I don't want to make this seem like, Evangelion is the supreme recap, but I just think that I've personally needed an experience which has been much different to that with other recaps, because often it does feel like recaps are placeholders, and sometimes they literally are. But I don't feel like I got the placeholder experience with Death and Rebirth. And I think the big reason for this is that it isn't bouncing between narrators and actual content, or the past and the present, or the future and the present, or whatever. It's bouncing off its own content. It's bouncing off itself. And I think that this is kind of a display of how confident it is within its storyboards and its direction and its own content. It's able to utilize so much of it across the hour, if not all of it. It is made up of footage from the actual series in stunning 16:9, but the same footage nonetheless. And I just love that it doesn't need the same level of reinforcement to push it along. There is a bit of reinforcement, as we spoke about, stuff like splicing in these words and things like that, but on the whole, it is pretty self-sustained by what it already is, and doesn't need something to push it along and say what's happening or what's going to happen or what even happened. And I think that's just a testament to how great Evangelion is as a series. It was organized so well to the point to which it felt even, I would argue, even more digestible. That is with the assumption that you've seen the main series, obviously, but it even felt more digestible to an extent because it made things easier to chew by putting things in sections, by cutting things up in a nice way. Confusing, nonetheless. Eva's always been confusing in my opinion, but in a much nicer way. Not particularly better than the series, but in an interesting way. Let's just say that in a nice and interesting way. It just became much more digestible to understand that, oh, this is the story arc of this character. Oh, this is the theme which is really trying to convey. And since Eva, for me, also has been probably the most hard series to digest in my quote-unquote anime watching career, it's been a real help by doing this. And with that being said, that is the analysis for this week. Let's jump to closing thoughts straight away. I'm not even going to delay. And we will talk about what we can take away from recap episodes and Neon Genesis Evangelion, Death and Rebirth. So what can we take away from Neon Genesis Evangelion Death and Rebirth, or Death True Squared? The biggest and probably most obvious thing is that recap episodes can be great. And I'll be honest, I'm saying this to you, but I was also losing faith in them myself. I didn't know that this was possible, and maybe this is just me saying that I haven't watched enough anime, or I haven't seen enough, and that might be true. But I think that Neon Genesis Evangelion Death and Rebirth has given me the faith that I need to maybe watch a few more recap episodes, or recap movies, because there is value in them, but it's how you create the value. And I think Anu and Co and those who did work on boarding this did a great job at doing so. Just like anything, it's about how it's executed. When, brief animation example, when people like to think that 3D is inherently bad, I give them a bit of a weird look, even though I don't really see people say that in real life, but I give them a bit of a weird stare digitally, because it's a tool, and in this case, a recap episode is simply a thing or a container, and it's how we use the container which matters. And I think that's probably the big lesson for me, which I really need to think quite deeply about. The second thing is that editing is important. As someone that likes to focus on animation a lot, I will be honest and say that I don't think enough about edits. I think a lot about stuff like character acting and animation and battles and how they're all done and shot, but upon thinking a lot about the shots, I think a lot less about how the shots are put together. And Death and Rebirth taught me that how you put shots together is so important for the vibe we get from a series or from a movie. And I think Death and Rebirth is a great case study for seeing how your favorite series, based on how it's constructed, would be very different if it was constructed differently. And that's a really good test, really. I think watch Death and Rebirth if you've watched Evangelion before, because you'll probably get a different taste from it. It'll be a similar taste to the main series, of course, but it will be slightly different because it's put together differently, and it has a sort of different motivation because of it. It's important because it's able to skew how we think, and because it was able to skew how I think it was pretty successful. Thank you for listening to this episode of Get In The Mecha. That has been episode 88. I hope you did enjoy this one, and I'm happy to be discussing Evangelion once again. Also, on the note of the podcast changes, I will be updating you again on what will be going on, but it's a shame that I have to do this. But I don't want to slow the podcast down, and yeah, I just hope you understand, and yes, I hope you do enjoy the minisodes when they do come, but we still do have some regular podcast episodes at the moment. As always, if you do enjoy this podcast, there are a few things you can do. You can leave it a review on Apple Podcasts. That'll be very appreciated. If you subscribe, we're almost on 100 subscribers. I don't know if this will actually reach 100 subscribers when this is coming up, but 100 subscribers is almost there. So if you do enjoy this show, please do subscribe and leave it a like and comment anything as well. Good, bad, that's all fine. And then if you could do one last favor, that is tell a friend about this podcast, especially if they like Evangelion. So that is it for this week. I have nothing left to say. Have a nice weekend. Stay safe. I have been your host, Jamar, today, and this has been Get In The Mecha. The music in this production goes as follows: Synthwave by Alex McCulloch, Mandatory Overtime by Joth, Difference by Chasersgaming, and Anomaly by Eric Matyas under soundimage.org.